And it's good to have you join us at the beginning of our Christmas series, You Need Christmas. I'm gonna pray one more time before we get going, and then we'll have a look at what this list of names teaches us about Christmas. Just before we do, you guys will remember that earlier this year, Vedette's mum passed away, and her dad is going in for triple bypass tomorrow. So if you please keep him and her and the entire family in your prayers, that would be appreciated. It's probably a nerve-wracking time. Let me pray for them and pray for us as we begin. Father, thank you for the comforting prayer we were part of just now, that we sent to you and spoke to you through Sandy. Thank you that you hear our prayers, that you are the one who is always listening. And so we bring before you two very important things right now. Our sister and her father, and their health and their hearts, both literally and emotionally. Would you be kind to them? Would you make that surgery go well? And for Llewellyn to be restored. And then secondly, we pray that you would take this list of names and help us see what it teaches us about you, what it teaches us about Jesus, and what it teaches us about why we need Christmas and why it's so important to us. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So our theme for this month, as Nelisi said, is You Need Christmas. We want to remind ourselves of the fact that Christmas is not just about food and fun and family with a bit of religious stuff chucked in on the side, but there is actually a reality behind it that we all desperately need. I need it. You need it. And we've got the tree up there today just to get us building on this. What we've always done traditionally as a family is we've, in the beginning of December, put up the tree, and then every night we've added a certain decoration to it. And that's kind of what we're going to be doing this month. We're starting with the tree and the balls there, and then every week we'll add something to it. And the reason we're beginning with the tree is to think through this family tree of faith. Family is a great thing. But sometimes you might have some awkward people in your family. I want you to have a look at these family photos, Christmas family photos, just to kind of show you what I mean. Yeah, you can just scroll through them. Hopefully they're there. They're gone. You're kidding. What did you do with my photos? Yeah, they're wonderful. That is the awkward family that I'm speaking of. I was thinking actually as we had these family photos up, is I'm still desperate to get a photo of the four of us. We're holding candles, so we can be carols by candlelight. And knowing that Kate would be so excited about that idea, to have her and the boys like looking down like this, and then it'd be me going, yeah, we got it. And that would be that kind of awkward family photo that we're thinking of. Oh, but there were some classics in here. Are they there?
They're there, but they're not there. Give me a second.
This is like the wait before opening the present. I mean, this is as if, there you go. That's the last one. I got this especially for my growth group because we were debating this sort of matching jumpers and pajamas in our last growth group evening. So there you go. This is why I'm kind of anti the idea. That photo might be a little hard to see, but everyone, including the kids, have got cigarettes dangling out of their mouths. I think it's Eastern European, but no. Then the other ones. Please, there's the one. There's the two brothers, like the one silhouette, and then there's the swimming costume one. That sounds worse than what it is. No? Oh, well, you got a taster for it. Every family, I guess, has these people in and that we kind of try and hide the family photos. You want to take that family off the mantelpiece when a prospective husband or wife comes to visit. And they're probably fantastic people, they're probably lovely people, but their photo ideas are as cheesy as the carols by candlelight one. But I want you to imagine, don't stress, Edge, we can leave it. I want you to imagine these guys in your family tree. Think about these guys. There's the great-grandfather who started a cult in which they sacrificed children. There's the other great-great-grandfather who slept with another man's wife, even though he had a few of his own, and then he had the man killed to hide the fact. There's the great-great-great-great-grandmother who was a lady of the night, and there's the other great-great-great-great-great-grandmother who tricked her father-in-law into getting her pregnant. If they were in your family tree, you'd really want to keep quiet about them, wouldn't you? No Christmas meals with them, especially if you want to impress people. In fact, I was just thinking about the fact of how excited I was that I grew up in the time before Google, because when Kate and I started dating, my now mother-in-law actually went and Googled me to find out what she could. And she tried to meet some of my extended family across the country just to kind of see what family I came from. We kept the odd ones hidden, though. And I guess for many people that's important. You check out the history of that family. And if you're trying to impress people, there are some folks that you would keep quiet about. Not Matthew. Not Matthew. The cultist, the murdering adulterer, the prostitute, the whole range of different characters of differing moral standards are all in this family tree of Jesus that Sam read for us just now. Which is very strange if you think about it, because if you're starting your presentation, your gospel, on why Jesus is worth following, why Jesus is the one God has sent to free mankind and save mankind, would you list that group of people in the genealogy of the Messiah? Don't we hide embarrassing family? Now, genealogies in the Bible are not exactly popular reading material. They're not considered very exciting, but they're full of intriguing information. And I think in the case of this family tree, very encouraging information. This family tree tells us a lot about Jesus and the family that he is born into, because Matthew is listing Joseph's line, and Jesus is adopted into Joseph's family. It gives background to Joseph and to Jesus' family. It gives background into what his coming means for us as people. And it highlights, therefore, for us why we need Christmas, why the coming of Jesus is so necessary for each of us. And this afternoon, I just want to highlight two things that Jesus' genealogy points out for us about his birth and about Christmas. And the first thing is this: the arrival of Jesus indicates the fulfillment of God's promises. So the next verse up there is verse 1, and it reads, an account of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And at the end of that, verse 17, it lists that again, all the generations from Abraham to David, from David to the exile, 14 generations, from the exile to Babylon until the Messiah. Now, Messiah and Christ are the same word. Messiah is the Hebrew version, Christ is the Greek version. Each of these refers back to Adam. So what Matthew is trying to tell us is that here's a continuous promise that runs all the way from Abraham all the way to Jesus the Christ. So back in Genesis 12, the first book of the Bible, God made a promise to Abraham that through him, his descendants, the people of Israel, the nations of the world would be blessed. And so in tracing Jesus all the way back to Abraham, Matthew is making the point to us that in Jesus we have the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. That in that baby born that first Christmas, God would work out his promise to Abraham. Now, not only that promise, that one, but also a promise that was in there to Judah, who was the son of Jacob. Judah was promised that the king would come from his line. But I think most importantly, other than Abraham, the promise to David. David is mentioned in verse 6, King David. He was promised a son who would reign eternally. And those two promises are called covenants. They are binding oaths made by people, like a marriage covenant. And God makes a covenant with Abraham. He makes a covenant with David. And he says, these are the promises that I am guaranteeing to you. Blessing to all the nations, Abraham, and an eternal king in your line, David. Matthew's saying to us as he lists these and mentions them and traces the lines back to them, they are fulfilled in Jesus. So we picked Generations Rise, Generations Fall to sing today. In Jesus Christ, we have your every word fulfilled. through promises made over the course of well over 1,500 years, in different circumstances to different people, Jesus' arrival is seen as God coming through on his promise. So it shows us that while God may take longer than we would like, just think 1,500 years for Abraham, or he might take us through situations that frighten us, like Israel having gone through Egypt and the Exodus all the way to the exile, God will do what he has said he would do. The arrival of Jesus shows us proof of God's faithfulness to what he has said. Now, I know I mention God's faithfulness often. We hear about God's faithfulness often. And you might think to yourself, yes, I get it. God is faithful. But we need to hear it often because we forget it all the time. Throughout the Gospel of Matthew, he knows this. He makes every effort to quote the Old Testament all the time so that we can see as his readers just how God comes through on what he has said he would do. Why do you need Christmas? Well, it's a time for you to reflect then, no matter what type of year you've had, on how God has fulfilled his promises to you and how God will always fulfill his promises to you. Because if he hasn't yet, you think that it could take 100 or 500 or 1,000 years. Or it could be that in not answering, he is actually fulfilling a promise to you. It is a reminder for you that no matter where life finds you at the moment, God is not silent, God has not forgotten you, and God is still at work. That long list of names shows us how God actually was always at work. He always had that in mind, bringing things and people together to make sure that the Messiah would arrive at just the right time, taking broken, messy, sinful people through normal generational life or through complex and complicated and horrible situations, and still bringing about his promise. God will do what he has said. And when we celebrate Jesus' first coming at Christmas, it reminds us that God has promised Christ will come again. I mean, that long list of names and the time it indicates, God will fulfill his promise. It might take very long, but he will make it happen. Jesus will return, and don't despair or doubt when he takes time. There's that classic Christian book called The Pilgrim's Progress, which I would recommend you read. Maybe find a simple version of it because it can be hectic. But in The Pilgrim's Progress, the hero of the story is called Christian. He's the pilgrim, and he is on his way to the promised land. And at one point in time, he finds himself in a dungeon. It's called the Dungeon of Despair. And it is in the castle of doubt. And he's in that dungeon. So this is now allegory for when you are in despair and in doubt. It's like this prison. And he is in there despairing and doubting until he remembers something someone had told him. That the key to getting out of that castle are the promises of God. And so he uses the key and he leaves despair and he leaves doubt behind. Know the promises of God. Know that he will keep them. The birth of the Messiah shows you that. That is the key for you when you're in times of doubt and despair. Know the promises of God. The coming of Jesus is proof that God keeps his word, and that is a reason why we need Christmas. We need to remember that as the years go by and hardships come and life is tough, we need to remember it as we get older and sometimes discouraged by the life that we have. Maybe for you guys who are still young, you need Christmas to remind you that sometimes you need to look up from the mad rush you have to grow up, finish school, go to university, do all those things, and realize that it's not depressing, but I think sobering reality, that life turns, seasons turn. And while things might take time, in the case of God and his promises, they will come to pass. That's the first thing. The second thing the birth of Jesus shows us is that of inclusion. And I know inclusion is a bit of a buzzword at the moment, But I think it is partly a buzzword because people feel left out. People feel isolated. There's this, I don't know if you realize, a few weeks ago we passed the 8 billion people worldwide mark. So many people there are. And one of the besetting issues in the Western world at least is loneliness. People feel isolated. They feel left out socially, politically, ideologically. You might just feel left out at school. You might feel isolated in the family you're in. Perhaps you even feel isolated here at church. You just feel left out. It's your experience that you have. And I mentioned to you before, but I think you see it in the fact that everything has to have the word family behind it. You're in this school's family and that school's family. Welcome to the Checkers family, or the Take-A-Lot family, or the Sharks family. There's this desire for everything to be family because we want to be included. And I think it's because it's ingrained into us as humans. We were made for that kind of relationship. We were made to be in God's family. And this desire for it stems from the fact that we understand, that we deep down understand that by nature we are not included in that relationship with God, with the God who made us. God is naturally speaking very, very separate from us. And you see that throughout the Old Testament and the time leading up to the birth of Jesus. The Old Testament showed us that you couldn't just walk up to God and say, "Hey, how's it? It's me. How's it going?" There was this gap between people and God. God is very separate from people. It's called His holiness. And we are not holy, and we're excluded from His presence, like paper and fire. We just can't be in the same place. And in the Old Testament, God chose a people for Himself. And this people could, through a very complicated sacrificial system, at some points in time, some regulations, be in His presence. And as for other nations, well, they were excluded. For those who sinned, they were excluded, unless they went through this sacrificial system. For those with illnesses, they were excluded. For those who were A or B or C, they were excluded. To be included into God's family was a tricky thing. And yet, as I mentioned, Jesus' arrival in this line of Abraham shows that there's this king, this Christ, is for all the nations, because remember, it would be through all the nations, through Abraham, that all the nations were blessed. Not just Jews, not just Europeans, all nations. And you see that when you see in verse 5 the mention of Ruth. Ruth is one of 4 women mentioned in Jesus' timeline, which might not seem like anything for us, but for the people in Jesus' day, that was quite a thing. Family lines were by the men. Now, Ruth was not Jewish. She was from Moab. Moab was a nation not favored by God. And yet, she occupies a prominent position. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered King David, grandmother of David and great-great-great-great-grandmother of Jesus. Mentioning her shows us one thing, that we who are not Jewish have a place in God's family. The other thing it shows us is that those of us with a history are included in the family. Those who have a past that we're ashamed of us. I think we often feel, some of us might feel this more than others, that we don't deserve to be God's children. You might be here thinking that God wouldn't want you, or could not forgive you, could not forgive your history. And Christmas is a time where you guiltily sit in church. Jesus' genealogy shows you different. He comes to be the sacrifice, to end all sacrifices. And if you hold on to Him, if you trust in Him, you're considered clean and you're brought into God's family, included into God's people. And I mentioned that there were 4 women in this family tree. They're 4 very awkward people, actually, to have in a Jewish family tree. Because in verse 3, we have the mention of Tamar. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. She was Judah's daughter-in-law. And she pretended to be a prostitute by the side of the road so that he would get her pregnant. Rahab, the mother of Boaz, in verse 5, she's the Rahab from the story of Jericho. She had been a prostitute. Ruth was the foreigner from a country with despicable practices, sexually oriented cults, etc. She was awkward in a Jewish family tree. And then, very interestingly, the mother of Solomon in verse 6 is not named. She's Bathsheba. She is the one who King David slept with before he had her husband Uriah the Hittite murdered. But it's not just the women here who are awkward in the family tree. It's most of the men here, including the kings of Judah, were just a total mess. The cultist I mentioned earlier was Manasseh. He was the king who decided that worshipping the Lord was not for him, and he started a cult where people sacrificed their children to the fire, etc., etc., etc. He was just loony. And they're here. I think they show us not only, the idea I mentioned just now, which was quite foreign to people at Jesus' time, that mentioning mothers in a family tree was a good thing. Christianity changed that. But they also shows that there is hope and inclusion and restoration for those with the past. God has not written you off. Jesus has come to make a place for all, even you if that's you. He has come to make us clean. He's come to make all of us presentable to God. And this genealogy shows us a glimpse of that. He's come for the foreigner. He's come for the one with history. And then thirdly, for those of us who've been wronged, who've been hurt and despised, I mentioned Uriah in verse 6. Solomon is mentioned as being fathered by Uriah's wife. Uriah the Hittite was one of David's kind of secret service agents. He was one of his warriors. He looked after David. He's kind of a bodyguard. And he is sent to his death to hide David's sin because David had this adulterous affair with Bathsheba and he wanted to hide the resultant pregnancy. I mean, that's just terrible reward for his service. But here he is. He's mentioned in Jesus' timeline, even though he's not really a part of it. Still given a position of pride. Jesus does that for the one who is wronged, the one who is despised. He lifts your head. He wipes your tears. He makes you a brother or a sister. The coming of Jesus, this genealogy points to that inclusion of those of the past or those who have been wronged. And then it also points us, next one, to the inclusion of those in exile. So the genealogy is split into 3 sections, 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David until the exile, and then from the exile, 14 until the Christ. The exile of the Jews to Babylon, which occurred about 580 odd BC, was the low point in their history. It was punishment for their failure to keep their covenant with God. And it symbolized them being excluded from the presence of God. They were sent away from God, away from his land, away from communion with him. But before the exile and during the exile, there was this hope expressed by the prophets that God himself would come and fetch them. God himself would come and restore this relationship that they'd lost. God himself would be their shepherd. God himself would be their king. And it's hinted at here from the exile to the Christ, the king. Matthew is saying here, Jesus has come to end the exile. He's here to shut it off. That's the end of it. But if you are far from God at the end of this year, Christmas, the coming of Jesus, is a reminder that God has come for you. That God has come near to say, here I am, come to me, I've come to fetch you. Perhaps you've always felt far from God. And this year, perhaps today, you sense that. And this call from God is saying, look what I have done to bring you back. I haven't sent anyone else. Come myself. Heed the call. Turn back to God. And you can do that. You can do that now. You can do that at any time. Just say, I'm sorry I've veered away from you. I'm sorry I've lived outside of you. I want to be part of you. And you grab hold of Jesus and you follow Jesus back to God. Perhaps you're sitting here today and you're someone who've remembered the time in your life where God found you, but you've wondered, You've wandered and you've kind of meandered a little bit, and you realize you're far from him. And you can just stop. Turn back this Christmas. Remember what God has done for you. Remember that Jesus means this homecoming and this inclusion. And you can do the same. Lord, I'm sorry I've wandered off. You renew your trust in Jesus as the one who brings you back to God, who includes you in his plan. The birth of Jesus indicates that inclusion of those in exile, of those who've been hurt, of those who have a past, and those of us who are not Jewish. We can be part of God's plan, part of God's family. I want to mention two final groups, just for us to think about. The birth of Jesus is the final indicator, the big sort of signpost in history that God was willing to do everything necessary to restore his relationship to humanity. A relationship that God considered was damaged. Now, you might be sitting here this afternoon thinking, well, I haven't been wronged. I don't feel I've wandered from God. I don't feel like there's anything really that I need. I'm okay with God. Thanks very much. Please don't leave here thinking that. Please don't leave here thinking that. The coming of Jesus means that God was taking very seriously the fact that none of us is right with him. None of us is okay. None of us is naturally part of the family of God because we think it's our right, because we think we're nice people. You need Christmas. You need Jesus. You're only included when you're joined to him. And then the second group that we need to think about is us as a church. As we celebrate in our hearts the fact that Jesus would do this for us, I want us to remember that we don't want, as God's people, we don't want anything to stand in the way of others being grafted into the tree. Perhaps you have family who are awkward, like those pictures. Jesus is for them as well. Perhaps you think Jesus isn't for those that you don't like, or those you disagree with politically, or those who battle identity issues or sexual preferences. Perhaps you kind of feel like, this is my little thing I want to hold on to. I don't think it's for you. Perhaps there are people we don't like. Perhaps there are ways we want to do things which just by nature exclude other people, and they're just because we like them that way. Remember the lesson we learned earlier this year from Jonah. We all need Jesus, and we want to hold him out to everyone and anyone. So we don't want anything to stand in the way of people being brought into God's family. And perhaps this Christmas, as we carry on with this series, you want to think about those you want to invite here on a Sunday. Christmas is a great time to invite people to hear the gospel. People are open to it. You want to think about those you can bring with you over the next few weeks. We need Christmas. We need it to celebrate that God will always come through on his promises. That timeline shows us that. But we also need it to show that the coming of Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ, means that everyone who follows him can be restored to God, can be included into God's wonderful plan for humanity, and included into his new and renewed family tree.